America will not be safe. So he himself is making this a very political exercise, which I think is one of the reasons why, it's become a confrontation.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Backstory. I'm your host and the creator of Backstory, Dana Lewis, coming to you this week from the south of France instead of my usual base in London. First, try to remember these words, and I'll ask you them at the end of the broadcast. Person, woman, man, camera, TV. In this episode, Portland and Trump's law and order platform.
I am mobilizing all available federal resources, civilian and military, to stop the rioting and looting, to end the destruction and arson.
For more than 50 days, demonstrators have been on Portland streets, most peaceful, some not. And Trump has called in federal forces in army fatigues, unidentified, snatch squads, and he's threatened to do the same in other cities in America. He says to keep the peace. Governors and mayors say he's trying to politicize policing, and he's made everything worse, they say. Our first guest, a chief White House correspondent for the newspaper Donald Trump hates, because it does the job so well and honors the call to truth in journalism. But hey, nobody's perfect. Peter Baker is the chief White House correspondent at the New York Times, great newspaper, and he is a terrific correspondent. And Peter, you and I have crossed paths, I think, from Russia to Afghanistan and Iraq and in Jerusalem. And you really have bitten into a big news cycle now, haven't you, in Washington?
Yeah, who would have thought, Dana, that those would have been the good old days, right? But yeah, it's a pretty crazy time here in Washington.
Yeah, it makes a war zone look a bit calmer.
It does, oddly. There's a certain, at least, logic to some of the things we would see in various places around the world. And here, it just feels like everything's kind of out of control.
Do you kind of feel like you're just reeling from one crisis to another? I mean, Trump is able to take a gust of wind and polish it up into a hurricane almost daily, it looks like.
Yeah, you can't keep track of all the big stories. And sometimes you realize that the big story that felt like months ago was just actually yesterday. We're moving on from, a global pandemic that here has killed 140,000 people to economic collapse. New unemployment numbers today are terrible. But we've also got now federal police in the streets of cities that don't want them. We've got a president bragging about taking a cognitive test. It's just it's a nonstop news marathon, and it's hard to keep up.
I did an interview with a very well-known Democrat pollster, admittedly, but Stan Greenberg knows his stuff, and he was saying he doesn't think Trump's going to get reelected, that he's been abandoned by huge swaths of working women, people of race, all kinds of Republicans. I mean, it doesn't look pretty when you take a look at his demographics right now.
No, it really doesn't. He's behind by double digits in almost all the polls, and he's an incumbent president. You can't find in history going back an incumbent president who has been so far behind and come back to win since Harry Truman in 1948. Very different circumstances, of course. Doesn't mean he can't. It doesn't mean that he won't. Things can change. What we've seen changed in the last 100 days. The world has changed so much. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 100 days? But all the fundamentals right now are not looking good for the president.
All right, so he's got a new issue. I mean, it looks like he's been listening to focus groups or something, I'm guessing, but law and order. He's tweeting it. He's talking about it. He's sending, men in fatigues, federal forces into Portland to start with, and it looks like he's going to expand that with no name tags, snatch and grab off the streets in cases. I mean, I don't think anybody has seen that in the history that I can think of in the U.S. when you talk about First Amendment rights.
Well, it's hard to think of a direct parallel, but you're right. I mean, and what's interesting, of course, is the president himself is talking about it in strictly partisan political terms. When he talks about the need to recapture control of the streets, he makes a point every time of saying these are cities led by liberal Democrats. And then he makes the connection to his own race in the fall, saying, if you elect Joe Biden, America will not be safe. So he himself is making this a very political exercise, which I think is one of the reasons why it's become a confrontation rather than, any kind of federal state cooperation to manage any issues that might be legitimate and might need to be addressed. And that's where we are right now with 100 days toward the election. Everything is political, everything is partisan, and it's just a very divisive moment.
How do you see it? I mean, the left is saying this is an infringement of our rights. These people are peacefully protesting and taking out their anger and their emotions after the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. On the right, it's lawlessness. People are rioting. They're burning buildings. The president has to get involved. The truth is surely, definitely in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, look, most of the protests we've seen in this country over the last 6 weeks have been peaceful. Most of the protesters, I was at them in Washington, most of them were just trying to make a political point. But there are those who have gotten violent, and there are those who have gotten confrontational with the police, and they've gotten, damaged buildings and so forth. It's not the majority. It's not even close to the majority, but it has obviously created a great deal of visceral images on TV. The president is focusing on that and sort of conflating it all as if they're all rioters, they're all anarchists. And that's, of course, to his political advantage, he thinks, because he thinks that it will turn off voters outside of those cities and say, well, we need to stick with a strong president who's going to protect us from Antifa or other, radicals.
Right. And you have the local governors and the state governors, and you have the mayor saying that he's absolutely making it worse. This isn't what they want.
Yeah, exactly. This is not a situation where the president is saying, hey, do you need my help? I'm willing to send some folks who would help you out. This is a situation where he's trying to override the local elected leaders, and he's trying to, superimpose his own judgment over them. It's a very, very inflammatory situation right now. The mayors and governors are saying, we don't want you. We don't want you to come in, especially on a separate chain of command where we don't have any connection with what's going on here. We'll sue, some of them are saying, if you do. And it's just become a very volatile moment.
What's the pothole down the road? How dangerous can this get as we approach November and he starts using federal forces not against state authorities, but intervening without being invited?
Yeah, there are all kinds of, dangerous scenarios here that could get out of hand, no question about it. And we're also conflating different things. We're talking about, there are some in Portland, they're talking about protecting federal buildings and quelling demonstrations. In Chicago, they're talking about crime, just basic crime, not demonstrations or political events. These are different kinds of scenarios. The crime issues in Chicago are very different than, public demonstrations in Portland, but they're all being conflated together as if the cities are somehow out of control back in the 1960s and 70s kind of way, and that you have a law and order president like Richard Nixon talked about being back in that period.
And you have some of these new campaign ads that have come out with a burglar entering an old lady's home, and she's sitting there watching the nightly news, I guess, and she calls 911, and there's no answer because of police defunding. I mean, that seems pretty torqued politics. Well,
it's the politics of fear, of course. It's not the first time that's happened. We've seen ads like this in many elections in which crime has been an issue. It's often a play to voters' fears. But it's also, a reflection of the fact that voters are split themselves about this. Polls show that they're very supportive of the Black Lives Matters movement as a concept, at least, the idea that there is racial injustice that needs to be addressed here and that the police need to be reformed. At the same time, most of the public doesn't support ideas like defunding the police, and that either needs to be explained better or it needs to be or it's just not going to be getting support of the majority because most don't feel that's a good idea. And that's what the president is talking about. He's trying to say, look, this would be the consequence if you defund the police. And that, I think, plays to the fears that a lot of Americans have about that.
Is this a minefield for Joe Biden if he doesn't handle it right?
Well, it is. But Biden's strategy so far has been basically, to stay out of sight. I mean, he's giving some speeches and he's doing some talks, but basically he's winning by not really being out there very public. And I think at first Democrats were concerned that the COVID pandemic meant that he wasn't going to be seen enough. And now they realize he's winning with a double-digit lead, even though he's not being seen. And so why mess with a strategy that seems to be working? At some point this fall, he'll be more visible. It'll be, the question is whether it becomes a referendum or stays a referendum on Trump or becomes a choice between Trump and Biden. That's what the president wants. He wants the latter. He wants to make it a choice and then to try to tear down Biden and tell voters, look, the other choice is no good.
Do you think that the problem with crime and Trump saying that he is the solution to law and order, do you think that is going to somehow make his mishandling of COVID-19 fade, or is that going to be the prime, the prime issue in the election in November?
I think he'd rather talk about, violence in the streets and his law and order view of things than the COVID. No question about it. Polls show, though, that the coronavirus is the number one issue for Americans right now, and it's just sweeping through parts of the South and the West in terrible numbers, worse than it were in terms of number of cases than they were in March and April when we thought we were at the peak. And so I think that's still the dominant issue because it affects so much. It affects the economy, it affects the ability of kids to go to school, it affects so many things. And you see the president, in effect, acknowledging that that's the case by resuming these daily televised briefings. He'll have another one today, that sort of acknowledges that it's not going away the way he was trying to tell us for weeks it was.
And you have to sit through those.
Yeah, absolutely. Although they're tighter these times. He's trying to make not as sprawling and rambling as they were in the spring. We'll see if it sticks to that. But the last two he's had have been relatively disciplined, at least for him. Ending in about half an hour without going too far afield.
Last question. Do you think that November is going to be a violent time? Are you worried about how this election is going to play out based on how polarized the two sides are right now? And there's a lot of things going on in the street.
I think it's a very volatile moment and a very unpredictable moment. Most elections, have certain rhythms and structures that you can kind of, recognize patterns from the past. And you can make predictions or judgments, if you will. This one it's against the backdrop of so much uncertainty. Will people feel comfortable even going to the polls if the virus is out there, ravaging the country the way it is now? How will mail-in voting work? The president is already sort of setting the stage, challenge the legitimacy of the election by making unfounded, completely false claims about fraud that hasn't happened and isn't true. In order to basically explain away, presumably, if he doesn't win. And that's going to cause a great deal of consternation in the country, too. Will the election be viewed as legitimate? Will the president himself accept the results, particularly if the results aren't favorable to him? And what will happen with his supporters if he doesn't? It's a very, very uncertain moment here.
Peter, you're a great journalist, and I really am honored with your time. I appreciate it so much. It's good to see you again and great to talk to you.
Well, it's great to see you too, and I miss our days together, and I wish you all the best there. I hope you stay safe and stay healthy.
You have reached the 911 police emergency line. Due to defunding of the police department, we're sorry, but no one is here to take your call.
Who is Donald Trump? He mocks the disabled. He praises racists.
Very fine people.
He attacks the military.
I like people that weren't captured, okay?
This 53-year-old Navy veteran hit repeatedly.
He protects criminals. He sympathizes with child sex traffickers.
Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison.
I just wish her well, frankly.
And now he attacks mothers. Who is Donald Trump? Donald Trump is a disaster. Midas Touch is responsible for the content of this advertising.
You don't have to pick sides between law and order and supporting race issues in America. That's what Donald Trump wants you to do because he's torquing the discussion for political gain. You can support good policing, and I think reform police departments to get rid of bad officers and tactics, and still stand tall on race equality and stand strong against police brutality. In our next segment, the use of federal troops in places like Portland and Chicago. Is it just plain wrong? Dr. Darrin Porter is an expert witness on criminal justice, and he spent his career in the New York City Police Department. He was a lieutenant, and he also worked internal affairs. Darrin, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Dana, thank you so much. As always, it's a pleasure to contribute to the podcast.
Let's talk about Portland, first of all, because, look, I'm talking to you from the south of France right now. We're not even in North America. And there's a lot of perception here that federal authorities have been brought into Portland are being very heavy-handed. Snatch and grabs on the street. People are not wearing name tags on uniforms. They're in military fatigues. They're not even in police uniform.
Well, first off, I can understand it because I'm looking at this from a third-party perspective. So I'm speaking from a position of conjecture. What I see are armed officers that are representatives of the federal government that are conducting enforcement operations. Now, as per the president, he specifically stated the deployment of federal law enforcement agencies in Portland would totally run consistent with the protection and fortification of federal properties such as courthouses and statues. But now it's very difficult to assess if this is actually what's occurring because we're hearing versions of people, INS agents or ICE agents that are taking people into custody for immigration violations, things to that effect. We don't have a true, we don't have true information that can state that this is a fact. But it goes back to, this is something that's somewhat unusual to have the deployment of federal law enforcement agencies in a uniform capacity from the perspective of providing law enforcement and crowd control arenas.
To say it's unusual is an understatement, right? I mean, are you comfortable with that, first of all, as a policeman, to have federal authorities suddenly, on your turf, as were, carrying out arrests, some of them questionable under First Amendment rights? And as an American, are you comfortable with it?
Well, I've in many instances worked with federal task force while I was a member of the NYPD, and we did have somewhat a symbiotic relationship, because what was great about working with federal law enforcement agencies, the jurisdiction was wide and deep. So oftentimes if I had cases that extended to places like Texas, things to that effect, they were an immense asset. Now, when we go to what's happening in Portland, it's been 51 plus days that they've been experiencing unrest in the city of Portland. And the mayor hasn't been effective in terms of curbing the violence and the destruction to that society. So the silent majority, it feels as if their safety is being placed at risk. So I think that this was something that the president saw, and he felt that it was necessary to inject. So I can't tell you if I'm happy or unhappy, because my experience in dealing with the federal law enforcement agencies has been quite different. I just think that this was something that they haven't gotten under control. And this was basically the action that the president took.
But I mean, there are a lot of people that are saying that the vast majority of those street actions are not riots, that they're peaceful protests under the First Amendment, including, mothers who went out and were tear gassed.
Right. Not only mothers, I believe the mayor was tear gassed as recently as the last couple of days in the wake of being a participant in one of these demonstrations. I think what happens oftentimes, and this, I go back to placing my internal affairs hat in the NYPD on my head and saying that, look, I need to look at this from an empirical perspective as opposed to a place of conjecture and what I see on a television screen. I think that you really need to, and many times I've investigated these acts of police misconduct that were committed in demonstrations. And it just becomes so abstract and so chaotic. You really have to dissect it at from a point by point perspective to assess what is actually happening.
Well, let's just talk about that. I mean, with the NYPD, where you're used to dealing with a lot of different demonstrations around consulates and all sorts of things, there are units that are tasked to do that, are there not? And well trained.
Yes and no. Traditionally, what would happen is you would have the uniformed officers that are assigned to the different precincts, so to speak. And what they would do is they would just pull from different commands or different precincts and assign those officers at the location where the demonstration was located. The demonstrations are very different. So I give you an example. We had something we referred to as Occupy Wall Street here years ago.
Absolutely.
That type of demonstration is very different than a demonstration that would posture in front of a consulate and that's looking to draw attention to human rights violations.
That went on for a long time.
Right. So it's really dependent upon what type of demonstration is in play. So when we look in the wake of the death of George Floyd, which is a protest or demonstration that is occurring in Portland, Oregon, that's something similar that's happening in all major cities throughout the United States. These types of demonstrations become far more acrimonious than the mere posturing in front of a consulate, so to speak. So as a result of that, there has been a lot of violence that has been perpetuated in these types of demonstrations. And we go back to what happened in Seattle, for example. We had demonstrators or protesters that took over a 6-block radius of downtown Seattle. And this subsequently resulted in homicides and numerous shootings in that area we refer to as the chop zone. This was something that was positioned on national television, and the country as a whole was aghast that this was something that was able to take place in an American city without proper law enforcement to interdict it.
But who best to deal with that? The local law enforcement officers and maybe state and maybe National Guard? Or do you think these guys getting parachuted in military fatigues and no names, which, I'll come back to that because I think that's a real issue in any, real democracy, that they are
And
out there in shadowy, uniforms and carrying out what appears to be some shadowy activities. So people are uncomfortable with it.
And that's a great point, but we have to go back to, there's been 50 plus days of the unrest that's been occurring in Portland, Oregon, and the local law enforcement hasn't been effective in reducing the violence, the destruction of property in the wake of the demonstrations that have been consistent.
You don't think they have been?
Portland.
Can I just interrupt you on that? You don't think they've been effective? I mean,
Clearly
generally,
not.
a lot of the protests have been peaceful, and the destruction of property isn't that widespread in Portland, is it? They've tried to set the courthouse on fire and a few other things. I know that.
Right. It hasn't. Not only that, I believe they were looking to take a police precinct as well. So, and when we look at the teachable moments of how it happened in Seattle, I think us as a country have been diametrically opposed to the inability of the police department to control that 6-block radius in Seattle, Washington. So we saw it as a harbinger, and we read the tea leaves and felt that, look, something needs to be done here. The localized law enforcement was not effective. And I think that was attributed to the mayor's position of, look, let them protest. But there has been property damage. There has been people have been injured as a result of these protests. The gross majority of these protests were peaceful, but we have had people that have suffered injuries as a result.
So perception is reality, right? If the rest of America has the perception that federal authorities are being heavy-handed and that this is stomping on their First Amendment rights, that's going to create even more tension in Portland and in other cities, isn't it?
And that's a great point. But the perception is police are over-policing in the communities across the nation. And so there's not just a perception of the federal law enforcement agencies that have the quote unquote boots on the ground in Portland. There's also this perception of over-policing in the United States. That's why you hear the sentiments of defunding police and police reform. So when you combine the two entities, it's the same picture that we're viewing through the lens of.
Well, that's why President Trump seems to be shifting in his political campaign heading for November, and he's really starting to talk about law and order as a great, political platform. And whether that's fair or not, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of debate over the way he's twerking it. I mean, one of his latest commercials came out, and it's an elderly lady in her home watching the evening news, and somebody is in shadowy black, burglar gear coming in through the door with a crowbar, and she calls 911, and they say, sorry, nobody's on the shift to answer your call. I mean, there's a lot of fear that's being spread on the whole defund the police issue, isn't there?
Yes, but there's an element of truth attached to that, because what's happening in police departments throughout the country is they're experiencing precipitous drops in personnel because you have a lot of officers who are just retiring and they don't have the money to backfill the attrition. So the personnel structure is being extremely stretched. And I'll give you an example of what's happening here in New York. We have droves of officers that are retiring, and based on the defunding of $1 billion of the NYPD, we had a potential class that was coming in to backfill the attrition. That is no longer in play. So when you look at
how will that affect the street? How will that affect the street?
Well, when you look at the quantitative numbers in connection with 9/11, the response time is taking longer. It's taking longer for officers to respond to instances of a need of police service than it has in the past. Because what happens is you have such massive numbers of police officers that are being deployed for these demonstrations throughout New York City. And so when you look at the localized precincts, a lot of that support-based, the support-based officers are in other places. So you just don't.
So it may not have anything to do with defunding the police. It may, in fact, 9/11 response times may be the fact that there's just a lot of policemen being deployed to civil unrest right now.
Well, how the two infuse in connection with the defunding is based on the attrition rate. We've had a lot of officers that have left. And so the funding is not in play to hire the new officers. And so that's where the defunding comes into place. Because I give you an example, a tour in, let's say in a precinct in New York, you may have 25 cops that are working. But based on the massive retirements, that can cut down anywhere from 20 to 30% on that tour. So you depleted 20 to 30% of your personnel, and due to the defunding, you haven't backfilled it. So what it's amounting to is a longer period in response times.
Okay, two quick questions.
But at the same thing, and I just trying to, and I wasn't being surreptitious about this. That video or that commercial that you saw in connection with the lady that called, and you have a person that's shrouded in dark clothing. In no way, shape, or form do I think that this is the time for fear mongering. We need to introduce solutions that are sound, because this is a democratic society, and as a result of it being a democratic society, coupled with people's First Amendment rights that should be protected, we need to come to a common accord that is somewhat sensible in reducing crime, reducing violence, and these demonstrations can subsequently be handled on another level. And I just think the state of acrimony...
And reducing crime and reducing violence, by the way, for the demonstrators, and I'm not speaking for them, that would include brutal tactics by some policemen who are going beyond the bounds of what anybody would respect, even fellow policemen would respect.
Over-policing should never be accepted under any circumstances. Police misconduct is a bloody nose in the face of all reality.
What are your buddies telling you? Like, what are your ex-colleagues telling you that are still in the police department? I'm sure they don't believe in any of this defunding stuff, and the unions have been tough on it. But what's morale like right now? Are do they want to be on the street right now, or do they just want to get out? Some of them.
Well, I want to say 90% of all of my former colleagues are looking to retire, or they're in the process of
retiring. I thought you were younger than that, Darrin.
I'm 53 years old, so I'm an old man here.
Oh, you're not. Anyway, but so a lot of them are getting out, but we're due to get out anyway.
Well, some instances, yes, and some instances, no. You do have officers that are opting for early retirement just to do different things, because that cantankerous relationship between police and community has been frayed so severely and deep that it just seems like we don't have the right people at the forefront to right the ship.
Chicago. Trump is talking about now moving federal authorities into cities like Chicago, which has a lot of gun crime and a lot of issues. Do you see Portland and Chicago just as two separate discussions?
There's absolutely, there's a diametric difference between Portland and Chicago. When we look at what's happening in Portland, this is primarily demonstrations, crowd control, and the preservation of federal structures. That's kind of what it is over there. Uniformed officers from the federal government. When we look at what's happening in Chicago, this is more a surreptitious approach of plainclothes officers that are going to be injected in for the purpose of reducing gun violence and violent crime that's plaguing that area.
That's more like cracking gangs and drug dealers and that kind of thing.
Right, exactly. So it's more so from an investigative perspective in Chicago than it is in Portland. And I think what happens in Portland, that's going to be a relatively short-term solution with the federal law enforcement agents. They're going to come in for a short period of time, and then they're going to be removed. However, in Chicago, I think it's a far more long-term solution because you're conducting active investigations for felons.
Dr. Porter, first of all, I don't believe that you have any active colleagues that are really retiring, because I think you're a young guy, but I'm obviously mistaken on that. But I know you're in big media demand, and we appreciate your time and your insight on Backstory, man. I really appreciate you talking to us.
Dana, I appreciate what you do in the world of journalism, because you call it like you see it. You're an umpire, balls and strikes. There's no pull to the left, there's no pull to the right, and that's the key to effective journalism. So from a civilian's perspective, we appreciate the fact that you're getting the message out there unfiltered.
Thank you, Darrin. I would have appreciated a hockey analogy better being Canadian, but I'll go with you.
Well,
thank you, sir.
All right, take it easy and stay safe.
Okay, now back to where we began. What were those words? Person, woman, man, camera, TV. If you remembered, you were not a stable genius, but you passed President Trump's Alzheimer's test. He thought it was a cognitive test. I wouldn't boast about it. He did, and it's now selling a lot of t-shirts and hoodies. On that note, thanks. Listening. Backstory. Talk soon.